might be talking about Manchester soccer, because we have been dominating English football for the last 40 years, but no, I'm going to be talking about the way in which we've dominated music for the last 40 years, with a rather controversial argument, an immodest proposal, one might say. Unfortunately, they couldn't fit the title of my presentation in at the top of the screen, but it actually is Manchester being the greatest rock city in the world. Proposition I suspect not all of us would agree upon. Gentleman James, I'm sure, will be hitting you with some rebuttals, but let's face it. The history of rock and roll, are we thinking the Ramones, Talking Heads and Blondie? Or are we talking the Drones, Slaughter of the Dogs and John the Postman? I rest my case. Anyway, basically my argument in relation to the criteria is, should we say, a pound for pound argument. In that Manchester may not be as big as New York, LA or London, and may not have produced as many bands as other cities, but what it has done is produce bands that have been very significant on the history of rock and roll and on the changing nature of music. My setup here, oh, now they've got the title in but not my number 10, but essentially the 10 things that I have listed here are essentially genres of music that I am going to argue were either invented by Manchester bands, or at least Manchester bands became identified with their innovation and development. This is in a larger framework of the fact that, in my mind, there's something important about geography when it comes to music, and that oftentimes cities take on particular identity and character and traits over time. So my argument actually begins in the 19th century with the music halls. And this is a time when Manchester was indeed the centre of the world, because it was the centre of the Industrial Revolution. And it was at that time when a lot of ideas of things such as invention and innovation became very central to the city and to the personality of the city. A few things of note, for example, would be, well, it was the centre of cotton. That's where the main industry was. It was called Cottonopolis, Manchester at the time. And it was the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the 1830s. It was where the first passenger railways were invented. It's where the first trade unions came from. It's the infancy of the women's movement. All of these things are not only important in relation to the establishment of what I would call a working class identity, but also a rebellious identity and a somewhat insurrectionary identity. So I've associated my presentation with these 4 I words in arguing my case as the threads that run through the various facets of Manchester music history. The first is identity, and by this what I mean is that a lot of music tends to take its cues from other places. So you get, particularly in Britain, you get a lot of bands, let's say bands like Led Zeppelin or whatever, or U2, who clearly are copying American styles and often affecting American accents. What's interesting about a lot of Manchester bands is not only do they not do that, but they absolutely exaggerate their Mancunian accents and their Mancunian identity. There is what we might call a kind of swagger of identity. I guess another word for it would be arrogance. And this runs through a lot of the bands that I think I have listed up here and beyond. Invention is another key. As I mentioned, all of these genres to me come through Manchester and then cross-pollinate out into the world and through legacy. Innovation. One thing you see about the Manchester bands is each Manchester era does not copy the other. That's another feature oftentimes, it seems to me, of rock cities, is they have something and then everybody jumps on board. One thinks of something like grunge in Seattle, where the first few bands started having that grunge sound, and then you get a million grunge bands in Seattle, and there's not anything that goes out beyond that. One of the things that's interesting, it seems to be, in Manchester, even right to this day, is that Manchester keeps reinventing itself. It takes pride in the fact that it doesn't copy what's gone before, even if what has gone before has changed musical tapestry. So innovation is important, and as I mentioned in relation to the Industrial Revolution and the trade union movement, it's always been a rebel city as well. It's always had a strong working class identity and working class pride. It's always been anti-establishment in nature, and one of the features of a lot of this music that I'm talking about comes virtue of the fact that it is a kind of DIY city, do-it-yourself. It's an independent city. It's created its own rock and roll infrastructure such that it didn't have to keep on going down to London or pandering to London executives. It dances to its own tune, its own identity, and in that sense I think is quite rebellious. So there are a lot of people that are involved in the importance of Manchester as a rock city that have nothing to do with the actual playing of music. Perhaps the most important person of all is a guy called Tony Wilson, who started Factory Records, set up the Hacienda, publicised Manchester music around, and always gave the finger to London. That has been a very important aspect, it seems to me, of Manchester music identity. It's the way in which it basically has never answered to the establishment culture that tends to exist in larger cities. What you tend to find in those cities, like a New York, an LA or a London, it seems to me, is too much pressure from A&R people, industry people, basically telling you, you've got to play like this, you've got to produce it like this, you've got to sound like this, or we won't have you on our label. Well, Manchester said, screw that, we'll start our own labels, we'll do it our own way, we'll start our own studio, we'll do it our own way, we'll have our own producers, we'll have our own art and designers. These all became key figures in the history of Manchester music. So getting back to my pound for pound argument, it runs through, as I say, the 19th century. And the starting point for me is a type of music which, when a lot of the rest of the world were listening to American music, as indeed Britain did most of the time, and jazz, etc., in the 1930s, a guy arrived on the scene in Britain whose father had been at the heart of the what's called music hall tradition in Britain, which is kind of the equivalent of vaudeville in Britain, often in small pubs where you'd have performers, musicians, kind of playing kind of jaunty, lively, often kind of saucy humour, innuendo type songs, rebel songs for working class people. This is really where popular music begins in Britain as far as in the popular culture. And his son, George Formby, became the most successful person in Britain between 1935 and 1945. He featured in a number of films, as well as producing a lot of music. And even though I know I've been set up as a punk rock guy here, George Formby played what's called the banjolele, which was a cross between a ukulele and a banjo. And this was what he became famous for and became quite innovative. But his songs that he wrote were very kind of jaunty, upbeat songs. And you see that this tradition of musical kind of upbeat, you often hear it in like pub music nowadays, if you go into East London and stuff, this tradition still lingers, very kind of happy, sing-along, very funny, but also very kind of saucy and a little bit devilish in nature. It's lived on in certain traditions of British music that are not American. Traditions that run through things like oi punk, working class British punk in the late 70s, or through bands like Madness with their kind of ska sound that was kind of mixed with a music hall tradition. Or one of the bands I have a little later in the 1960s would be a band like the Hermits in the 60s, who themselves had a big hit in 1965. I think it was 65 or 64, I think it was 65, called I'm Henry VIII I Am. You may have heard that song, which itself was an old music hall standard from 1910. And music hall has always run through British music as a working class identified form, as a kind of upbeat, and a very English identified form. So the idea of not pandering to the forces of America and Americanization that are going on all around. The Beatles, for example, infamously during the Let It Be sessions, whenever they had a break, they'd get out the banjos and play George Formby songs with each other. He was a very beloved figure that he has his own society now in Britain and is kind of revered as an interesting figure. And one of the interesting things, how many people here have actually heard of George Formby? Just a few of you. And that's another interesting thing, not only about Manchester music, but the type of music that comes out of Manchester is, it rarely is a music that has massive international appeal because it doesn't want to have international appeal. It is kind of parochial in nature because it has a localized identity, but its influence has still been quite pervasive. George Formby, big in the 30s and 40s. Now, I kind of draw a blank going through the 50s really, because let's face it, was there British music in the 50s? Not much. And same in Manchester, but by the 60s, of course, we did have the rise of certain British bands that were clearly influenced more by American music. And during this period, Liverpool is often cited, 20 miles down the road from Manchester, Beatles, etc., as a significant band. Now, if we think of some of those bands, like those bands from the north, like Herman's Hermits or the Beatles, if you listen to those bands, they sound English. You can hear their English accents, as opposed to bands like the Animals or Rolling Stones that are trying to sound American. To me, this is again a very important distinction in the history of Manchester music and northern music of a kind of pride or a kind of identification with where you come from, rather than trying to kind of pander to mainstream tastes. Band I've mentioned in this category is the Hollies because I think they serve a little bit like the Byrds do in America. They're a band that almost kind of straddle that period of the early to mid 60s but move you into a kind of hippie culture. One of the key players in the Hollies was a guy called Graham Nash, who went on to be in Crosby, Stills and Nash when he moved over to Hollywood. They were very famous, the Hollies, for their harmonies, which were just as good as the Beatles, in my opinion. And the Hollies are an interesting band. They're almost a little bit, they are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but they're a little bit neglected, I think, when it comes to the history of rock music. They had an incredible amount of success, as indeed did Herman's Hermits. In fact, Herman's Hermits had more popularity in 1965 in America than the Beatles did. Some of these things are forgotten in history, but Manchester was an important force in that time. Now, some of the songs from that period by the Hollies and Herman's Hermits were actually written by a guy called Graham Gouldman. And Graham Gouldman wrote these songs. He also wrote a song called For Your Love, which you might recall, by the Yardbirds in 1965. He wrote these songs when he was 18 years old, Graham Gouldman. And a couple of years later, in the early 70s, was one of 4 members that formed a group called 10cc. Now 10cc are a group that sometimes again are a little bit overlooked because we only see them perhaps for some of their hits that we know of, like I'm Not in Love and all that. But one of the things about 10cc that's important is that they were studio geeks. So what they did when they got together, these 4 members, and Eric Stewart, their main lead singer, had also had some hits previously with a band called the Mindbenders. So they had some success in their own different ways. And Cream and Godley, 2 of the other guys as well, were kind of art school people. And they became this studio band, and they became so obsessed with their knob-twiddling antics that they actually created their own studio. That studio, Strawberry Studios, became very important to the history of Manchester music because, as I mentioned, up until that point, if you were from the north of England, you had to go down to London to produce your records, like the Beatles always did. They'd go down to Abbey Road, etc., to do their recordings. But what that process often involved was become kind of sucked into an industry mentality or industry decision making. The Strawberry Studios liberated Manchester music in many ways, and music from there on was constantly using Strawberry Studios right up to this day. A very used studio, Strawberry Studio, and a very important one for a lot of bands like Joy Division, right up to bands like Elbow and Doves today. But 10cc to me were innovators of what I would call not progressive music per se, but progressive music plus pop. And this came down in many ways to the makeup of the band, that some of them were kind of arty, intellectual types that gravitated to what we might call a prog rock type sound, but you had a kind of pop sensibility that came in as well. And I know a lot of hype right now surrounds Freddie Mercury and Queen and the multi-tracking of vocals and stuff, but it might be noted around the same period that 10cc produced their song I'm Not in Love with about 600 vocal tracks on it, all multi-tracked and stuff, and had an incredible kind of studio effect in a similar kind of way of taking progressive rock but giving it a kind of pop sensibility. Moving into the later 70s, certainly Manchester was involved in the punk scene. I'm not suggesting that punk was invented in Manchester by any means, but one of the things that did happen were two guys from a band called the Buzzcocks were the people that were responsible for bringing the Sex Pistols up to play in Manchester. And it was a famous show now, in retrospect, that occurred in 1976, where they booked it themselves at a very small club called the Lesser Free Trade Hall. And there were only about 50 people that came to the Pistols show, but in that audience were people that went on to form The Fall, New Order, Joy Division, the Smiths, and other bands. So it became a very significant event that the Buzzcocks formed. But my argument as far as innovation for the Buzzcocks is a genre that we now almost take for granted after bands like Green Day and Rancid and all these kind of California pop punk bands, is that sound really originates with the Buzzcocks. And the Buzzcocks in many ways are an incredibly rebellious group to do that within the midst of punk, when all those Pistols and Damned and Clash were kind of raging about street politics, etc. The Buzzcocks were singing kind of heartbreak love songs, which is almost like anathema to what punk was supposedly all about. But what they also created, arguably as well, was a genre that came to be known as queercore or homocore. Pete Shelley was a professed bisexual, and he would always write these songs deliberately using gender-neutral terminology and language, and is now recognised as a real innovator in relation to the homocore musical tradition that kind of sparked in the 1980s. Moving on to punk poetry, I thought I might do something a little silly and strange for you right now. I was going to play maybe some clips of music, but I thought instead I'd share a little punk poetry with you, because I suspect not many of you have either heard of punk poetry, nor maybe do you want to hear punk poetry, but punk poetry did start in Manchester through a guy called John Cooper Clarke. And boy was he a brave soul, because the punk poets were people that would often open up for the punk bands. And they'd come up on stage and they'd read their poems in a kind of punk style, often with punk content. But oftentimes the kind of louts in the audience, you know, wanted something a little more aggressive, so they'd basically be showering spit at them for the entirety of their show. And John Cooper Clarke was one of these people, now a legend of British culture, then an absolute weirdo. But he definitely sparked a genre that sparked many other punk poets, and arguably you could say subsequent movements like slam poetry. And perhaps also comes out of a tradition of some of the beat poets that also had kind of musical accompaniment prior to that. So, if you'll indulge me for 1 minute, I need to get into costume in order to be John Cooper Clarke. I might even need some extra lighting for this. You can't read John Cooper Clarke without at least looking a little bit like him. He didn't look very punk rock. In fact, he looked like he could be on the cover of Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde. And he would always wear a suit on stage as well, and then would always complain afterwards, saying, all these punk rockers were spitting on me for the entire show. My glasses on, yeah. this will also give me an opportunity to try and share with you my really bad impersonation of a Manchester accent that I haven't been to for a while. Here we go. This is one of his poems from that era. It came out in 1979, and it's very typical of the kind of punk content of the era, but this was just all done in terms of presentation of poetry that he would do in the punk clubs. So he was really putting himself on the line, a daring chap. This poem is now included in the Faber Book of British Verse, alongside the likes of Shakespeare and Philip Marlowe and other great British writers. So he has, we might say, been re-evaluated over time, even though at the time people thought him rather strange. Here goes, evidently Chicken Town. The bloody cops are bloody keen to bloody keep it bloody clean. The bloody chief's a bloody swine, who bloody draws a bloody line, a bloody fun and bloody games. The bloody kids he bloody blames are nowhere to be bloody found, anywhere in Chicken Town. The bloody scene is bloody sad, the bloody news is bloody bad, the bloody weed is bloody turf, the bloody speed is bloody surf, the bloody folks are bloody daft. Don't make me bloody laugh. It bloody hurts to look around everywhere in Chicken Town. The bloody train is bloody late, you bloody wait, you bloody wait, you bloody lost, you bloody found. Stuck in fucking Chicken Town. The bloody view is bloody vile for bloody miles and bloody miles. The bloody babies bloody cry, the bloody flowers bloody die, the bloody food is bloody muck, the bloody drains are bloody fucked. The colour scheme is bloody brown everywhere in Chicken Town. I'll leave it there. Back to costume number one. No more costume changes, Madonna fans, sorry. Anyway, punk poetry was another innovation out of Manchester. Post-punk was where Manchester started getting big on the international consciousness scale. And punk really in Britain had exhausted itself by about 78. And bands started to innovate and started to try new things. And when it comes to post-punk, I think most people would cite these bands as amongst the most important ones, and they're all from Manchester. Magazine, which was an offshoot of the Buzzcocks, through one of their original members. The Fall, much beloved by a DJ in England called John Peel, one of the longest running bands. Probably the most important band that's associated with post-punk was Joy Division. And a guy called Genesis P-Orridge is significant as well, even though his band, Throbbing Gristle, was based in London. He was a Mancunian and was very connected with a lot of these bands, good friends with the people from Joy Division, and if I'm not incorrect, I think was involved with the Hacienda show that you were at. It was. Genesis P-Orridge, yeah. And what you had from a lot of this post-punk scene was, again, the establishment of an infrastructure. And this came largely through Tony Wilson's creation of Factory Records, which had a lot of these post-punk bands on it. They were very innovative. Now, I think from this as well... Oh! Now we've gone blank again.
It's back.
Hey! Yo! Alright. So, you also have other genres that you could arguably say came out of this. Genesis P-Orridge is often seen as the originator of industrial music. But certainly the Joy Division sound also, and the Fall sound, also very much reflects the innovations of what became known as industrial music, a sound and production that was trying to capture the essence of raw urban life. It in many ways echoes some of the stuff that artists like the Italian Futurists were doing back in the 20s and 30s, using very kind of gritty, urban, street-sounding instruments and production techniques. There was a producer for Factory Records called Martin Hannett, who was a key player in all of this as well. So as I say, it's not just the musicians, and sometimes the artwork as well out of Factory Records was important by virtue of some of their really interesting designers like Peter Saville at the time. Factory Records was very key. You could also make a case that the genre which we now know as goth came from Joy Division as well. A very kind of bleak, dark, kind of fantasist element of music is often seen as running through Joy Division at least. We'll give a little shout out to Susie and the Banshees as well in London, but I'm going to argue my case for Joy Division as well. Now, from that post-punk scene, around the time of the late 70s, early 80s, you had a lot of kind of electronic music coming out of Britain. You know, we think of those Depeche Mode type bands and Human League and stuff, you know, with the little synthesizers and stuff. And New Order, in many ways, who were the band that took the Joy Division mantle and ran with it after Ian Curtis committed suicide. They started going to New York and listening to house music and dance music that was going on, and they kind of mixed it with a kind of Joy Division aesthetic and a kind of dance principles to create an indie sound for electronica. And one might have thought this was some kind of disastrous marriage, but it actually created some of the most successful music out of Manchester. One of the songs that they put out, New Order, called Blue Monday, went on to be the biggest selling 12-inch single of all time. So, very successful band. With that success, interestingly enough, some money started rolling in, even though they didn't actually make a penny on Blue Monday, because one of the things about factory records is they wanted to have things so interesting and innovative and creative that they often didn't give a shit about making money. And the expense of the covers that they made for the Blue Monday single were more than what they got back. So they ended up losing money on the biggest selling 12-inch single of all time. But that's typical of Tony Wilson. He just didn't care. And this is another feature of why I think Manchester is such a fantastic music city, is because it's not beholden to profits, it's always beholden to art. And I think that's a significant contribution in many ways of a lot of these bands. And New Order were the ones that were throwing all this money into the mix and never seeing any of it back. They feature again around number 9. But in the meantime, in the mid-80s, you had an interesting scene develop out of Manchester, and indeed the whole world, and we might say college radio in America, and that is indie music, or indie rock. And who's at the heart of that and its innovations in the early 80s? A band called the Smiths, led by Morrissey, who create a kind of maudlin, but not, everyone says the Smiths are depressing, but to me they're not depressing in the Joy Division sense of a kind of suicidal aura. There's a kind of humour and a wit. It's no surprise that Morrissey was very influenced by Oscar Wilde, a kind of bleak but humorous aesthetic, one might say. And the Smiths were very important in that respect. And they were a force throughout the mid-1980s and essentially revolutionised British independent music. This was the era of the indie, as they say. Everybody was putting indie music out on indie labels. And again, that's a very big, important feature of Manchester music. Not many of these bands were on major labels. And the Smiths could have gone to any label they wanted. They were so much in demand, but they went with Rough Trade, an independent label, instead, in order to maintain their own artistic integrity. Most of the money, as I mentioned, that New Order made, they were entangled with factory records, went into the development of their own nightclub. This became very important again to what we might call the infrastructure of Manchester music and developments, because that money went into the creation of this strange building and with its kind of brutalist industrial architecture called the Hacienda, which was somewhere where James, I know, has been to, went to with Burroughs in the early 80s, a time period when nobody went there. So there's this like big kind of cavernous venue that was really unpopular. But something happened in the late 80s. And like most musical revolutions, it was drugs. And in this case, it was the drug ecstasy that hit Manchester hard in the late 1980s. And that combined with this dance club Hacienda to produce a subculture. And in many ways, this is a subculture that has certain comparisons with the hippie movement in the late 1960s. This whole subculture, which had its own fashion, its own musical style, which was a cross between kind of dance music, house music, and classic kind of Manchester rock and indie sounds. People like the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays. This became known as the Madchester scene. And 1988 in England was called, or in Manchester was called our Summer of Love. It was essentially a kind of the equivalent of San Francisco in 1967 as far as they were concerned. Everyone was doing ecstasy and having a right old time. as excessive drugs usually lead to, this didn't have a happy ending, because Manchester not only had its name changed to Manchester, but soon also had its name changed to Gunchester. Because one of the things that this drug culture created was a gang culture at Hacienda, and that's what led to the place being shut down by the cops. That was pretty much the death of the Manchester scene when the Hacienda closed down. But Manchester music did have one last gasp, and that was its most successful group of all time, and that was Oasis, who sold out bigger concerts than have ever been sold out ever in Britain. Again, interestingly, biggest band of the 90s in Britain, but barely known in the United States. Very much, again, a band that has a strong Mancunian identity, has that arrogance, has that strong accent, has that love of northern identity. There was a lot of this north versus south stuff going on at that time. Oasis versus Blur, kind of the war of the two Britpop bands. But the reason for Britpop and for this Manchester sound that went on was the significant success of grunge music that had essentially invaded Britain. So it was almost like a kind of reverse British invasion that went on in Britain, and we couldn't get enough of your grunge music, boy bands, and all those horrible kind of pseudo-heavy metal bands that were invading our shores in the early 90s. And in response, Britpop was a way of almost reclaiming what we might call an English identity for music. And it's difficult to say. I mean, there are certainly other bands that I could mention, but that kind of takes us to the end of the 20th century, which, let's face it, it's pretty much the end of rock and roll, isn't it? The end of the 20th century, largely. Certainly there are other bands, but I'd like to close up with just two notable mentions along the way here. The first takes me back to the indie rock scene of the mid-80s. I don't know whether any of you a few months ago came here to see the last performance of Truck Stop Honeymoon, a band out of Lawrence. We're in Lawrence. They actually came up through New Orleans. Well, for those of you who aren't aware, one of the people that was at the heart of the indie rock scene in the mid-80s in Manchester was the lead singer of Truck Stop Honeymoon, Mike West, who was in a band called Man from Del Monte, and used to hang out with these bands like the Smiths, some of those early Oasis people who were hanging at the bars and stuff, and he had some kind of minor success while he was there. I know he was originally from Australia, but spent the 80s in Manchester. And my very last statement, some of you may well know our great hostess here, Stephanie Sticks. Is she in the house or is she in the other room? Stephanie? Are you there? Well, anyway, she might not want you to know this, but if you want to know anything more about the Hacienda, maybe she'll show you her tattoos. And somewhere in this building, there is a piece of wood that she paid some exorbitant amount of money for, that came from the Hacienda when it finally shut down. So, just goes to show the spread of Manchester music moves in mysterious ways. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Hand it over to Iain. Cheers, mate.
Yeah.